It is, says CNN, Ukraine's forgotten war. Beginning in November 2013, there appeared a series of protests in Maidan Square in Kiev. Because the protests were overwhelmingly supportive of economic and political integration with Europe, they became known as the Euromaidan protests. The protests forced the resignation of the government led by the corrupt old pro-Russian oligarch Viktor Yanukovych. The installation of a new government, as demonstrated in the leaked memo of senior US diplomat Victoria Nuland, shown here on the BBC website, was midwifed by the US and its allies. Here we have Nuland and Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt discussing who will go into the next government. Nuland: I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. Pyatt: yeah, I guess, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him stay out and do his political homework and stuff. Nuland: I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. What he needs is Klitsch and Tyanibok on the outside. And on they go, mapping out the future of another country's government. The subsequent invasion and annexation of the Ukrainian territory of Crimea by Russia and the beginning of armed rebellions in the eastern Donbas region led to civil war. So how have the media covered this? In the Western press, there is much critical attention to the failings, lies, and propaganda of the Russian media. And a lot of this is fair comment, but also rather easy. In this segment, I'll look at the performance of Western media on Ukraine in light of the same standards that these journalists and outlets have applied to the Russian media. Western journalists fault Russian media for giving a story entirely skewed in favor of Putin. The BBC reports that Russian media use misleading pictures, false narratives, and misrepresentation to distort the events in Ukraine for domestic viewers. Financial Times says Russia is purveying scaremongering stories about a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine to justify military intervention. Agence France-Presse reports that Russian media sparked horror with a totally uncorroborated story about the Ukrainian army engaging in child crucifixion. The examples of Russian media distortion stack up. According to The Guardian, this is the result of collusion between the Kremlin, powerful media oligarchs, and, as The Australian suggests, ideologues of greater Russian imperialism. But what about the major Western media? They're not always wrong in their criticisms of the Kremlin. They recognize imperialism when they see it, albeit not when the subject is American wars. And they are wise to scaremongering about fascism and humanitarian catastrophe to justify war, although, again, not in the case of American wars. Yet their coverage of Ukraine suggests that they have some way to go. Reporting of Maidan in Western media depicted freedom-loving masses against would-be Russian overlords. What was not widely reported was that, as the protests began, the country was, as reported in the Kiev Post, almost evenly divided in opinion between those who favoured being integrated into the European Union and those who favoured joining a Russian customs union. In fact, as Deutsche Welle reported, support for integration into the EU had declined in the months before the protests. Yet the subsequent elections, won by the billionaire oligarch Petro Poroshenko, seemed to support Yushchenko's claim in The Guardian that Ukraine had simply had a change of political elites and not a genuine revolution. One of the key episodes in the uprising was a shooting that took place in Maidan Square in February 2014, resulting in the deaths of 50 protesters. It was widely accepted in the media that pro-government snipers had instigated the killings. The Guardian reported that Maidan had seen the open use of live weapons and the deployment of police snipers to sow fear and terror. The bloodshed was the vital turning point leading to the downfall of the government. And when the new government blamed special police forces for the killings, it was reported uncritically by news outlets like the BBC. But a year later, the BBC, in their article, The Untold Story of the Massacres, reported eyewitness accounts from participants and shooters, which suggests that the events were driven by gunmen among the protesters. A special investigation by the wire service Reuters also shows that the Ukrainian government's prosecution of 3 individuals from riot police was characterized by serious flaws. What of the uprisings in the Donbas region, incorporating the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk? According to many Western journalists, this is sheer Russian aggression, an artificial conflict, as the neoconservative Anne Applebaum wrote for the Washington Post. Ian Burrell of The Independent calls it Putin's invasion. Yet, such claims entirely overlook the extent of popular demands for autonomy in those areas, as well as the extent of popular sympathy with Russia. After Yanukovych's government was overthrown, Ishchenko writes in The Guardian, "Many people in the East called the new regime the Kiev junta and disapprove of its actions." This led to a spate of large anti-Maidan protests in the east of the country, which were the basis of the eventual armed rebellions. A litmus test for honest reporting on this fraught issue is the handling of the issue of Ukrainian fascism. The Western press justifiably castigates Russian media for characterizing the Maidan protests as a fascist coup. Yet many Western journalists are anxious to do the opposite and explain away the role of Ukrainian fascism. The anti-communist historian Timothy Snyder of the New York Review of Books is typical in this respect. In a March 2014 piece entitled Putin versus Reality, he takes aim at the Russian myth that the overthrow of Yanukovych was a fascist coup by demonstrating its mass origins. So far, so good. But to justify this claim that the Ukrainian protests represented a classic popular revolution, he ignored entirely the powerful far-right current in Maidan. For example, the right sector, a group of far-right anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalist paramilitaries, played an important role not only in the protests, where they fought with police, but also in the subsequent post-Yanukovych government. One of the group's founders, Dmitry Yarosh, was, as Kiev Post tells us, appointed an advisor to the Ukrainian armed forces in June 2014. This after he had almost, according to the Financial Times, been appointed as a deputy to the National Security and Defense Council. Now, having promoted these ultra-nationalists and given them a role in the state, the Ukrainian government faces an insurgency led by the right sector who have acquired, according to the Financial Times, dozens of volunteer battalions in the battle against pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk. The article even reports that the right sector has much support in the Ukrainian military hierarchy. In addition to the right sector, there is Svoboda, a party whose racism and anti-Semitism forced the European Union to express some alarm. As David Spiegel reports for the CNN website, Svoboda's leader is on record saying that Kiev is governed by a Jewish Russian mafia. This party ended up with 4 ministerial posts in the post-Yanukovych government. This was particularly embarrassing for the European Union, as Svoboda was one of the most volubly pro-European parties in Ukraine, unlike the right sector. Snyder acknowledged the right sector and Svoboda in a piece entitled Fascism, Russia and Ukraine for the New York Review of Books, without mentioning their extreme racism. He even claims that it is the Ukrainian regime, rather than its opponents, that resorts to anti-Semitism, as if it couldn't be both. This would not be the first time Snyder had downplayed the crimes of fascism, as Daniel Lazar shows in this review of Snyder's book, Bloodlands, for Jacobin magazine. A similar approach was taken by Alan Newhouse in The Guardian, who argues that while there may have been some far-right protesters in Maidan, and a few in the government, there are few bona fide fascists. This strenuous hair-splitting in an article which does not mention the right sector, Frum's article also declined to mention them, may have worked if the Nazis hadn't then appeared in full regalia. The Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi volunteer infantry group working under the command of the Ukrainian National Guard. This is not just a minor irrelevant militia. It was, as the BBC reports, formed and armed by Ukraine's Interior Ministry. Again, a source of some embarrassment for the US and its allies, who are providing military training. Perhaps more insidious than either Snyder or Newhouse is Diane Francis, editor-at-large at Canada's right-wing newspaper, The National Post. Francis's piece, We Are All Ukrainians, written for the World Post, lavishes praise on the right sector, and a later piece, praising an emerging trade deal with Ukraine, describes the regime's achievements without a trace of irony, as including rebuilding its army with volunteer help. But fascism in Ukraine appears to be a product of the country being torn between 2 geopolitical rivals locked in a new Cold War. As the Russia expert Stephen F. Cohen explains to Salon, the US position is that Putin's attempt to grab a sphere of influence is unacceptable. But what is the expansion of NATO other than the expansion of the American zone or sphere of influence? And this is the underlying failure of the Western media. The whitewashing of the protests, the downplaying of legitimate divisions in Ukraine, and the demonization of Putin allows the media to represent the situation as a morality fable, the good Europeans versus the evil Ruskies. The distortions of the Western press are based on the belief that, as a letter signed by dozens of leading intellectuals from Ulrich Beck to Slavoj Žižek put it, the Ukrainian Maidan represents Europe at its best. Rather than discuss the geopolitical competition structuring Russian and American interventions, we get these ridiculous Cold War-style scare stories from CNN like, has Russian President Vladimir Putin gone completely mad? A story that was comprehensively debunked by fairness and accuracy in reporting. And when Obama accuses Russia of treating Ukraine as a revival of competition over some Cold War chessboard, as Politico reports, it never occurs to these media to ask what game the United States is playing. On that, the reporting is entirely credulous. And while their distortions are more subtle than their Russian counterparts, they're not less partisan as a result.